Hi, Paul. Hi, Jamie, and Josh, and Madhu, and Allie, and Francisco. Welcome, everyone, and Saroha. We'll give people one more minute to, and Ira, one more minute to hop on, but it looks like everyone's coming on in. Remember, when you say hello to people, we want to change the chat to say all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're saying. Okay, and so today we are going to talk about hypothesis testing. So it's often referred to as A/B testing, even though often we can have more than just A and B. There can be a number of variants. And it's also sometimes in industry called split testing. Okay, so today we're just going to have a quick PSA on correlation versus causation, creating a hypothesis. We're going to talk about A/B test design, some of the things that you're going to want to look out for in industry, and sample size and effect size for your hypothesis tests, because all of those numbers are very related. Okay, so this is a PSA. I'm sure we've all heard before that correlation does not imply causation, right? And this is super important because especially when in data science and machine learning, if we're building models, sometimes there'll be a variable that is highly significant and people are like, yeah, let's go look at the effect of, tweaking this thing and seeing if we can move the needle, right? And so we do have to test that to make sure that it is actually causation and not just correlation, because an example might be that somebody fills in a form and fills in all the fields versus some people just like give their name and hit enter. And that person who filled in all the fields, they're more engaged. So maybe they are correlated with, being less likely to attrit, which means like leave, cancel their subscription. But right, we can't change that. We can't make someone be more type A and fill in more information. And if we forced them to do that, that would actually cause drop off, right? So there is, this correlation versus causation that is very real in industry that we need to be thinking about, like, hey, is this a meaningful effect that we can have an impact on? Or are these, like, is there a causal relationship, or are these things just correlated? And so, an obvious example is when the sun is out, there's correlated with potentially consuming more ice cream, but the sun doesn't cause you to eat ice cream. However, it can cause a sunburn. And you may see a lot of sunburned people eating ice cream, but that doesn't mean that a sunburn causes you to consume ice cream either. But the beauty of A/B tests is when we randomize people to two different experiences, we can actually get at, is this a causal relationship, right? Did this change that we made cause a certain effect? And so the PSA here is, a lot of times when we do analysis, we might find something that's really interesting, but it's just correlation until we can prove that there was causation. Okay, and there are many different ways that we can have these causal relationships. So A can cause B, B can cause A. A and B can both be consequences of a common cause, right? So we also want to be thinking about the direction of that relationship and not just jumping to assumptions. Okay, so again, the point in A/B testing is that we want to be able to claim that a change that we made to a certain variable, whether that's a web page or it's that we're giving a group of humans a certain experience or drug or any sort of different treatment compared to a control group, we want to be able to say with a certain amount of certainty that there is a statistically significant increase or decrease in our success criteria. And so to be able to get at that, we need to make sure that we're only making one change per cell, and that's really insidious. And as you become sort of the subject matter expert on this topic in your organization, you're going to see how insidious it is. The marketing team will come to you and they'll be like, we want to test this. And you'll look at it and you'll be like, well, that messaging in that spot compared to, no messaging and no spot, that's two things you're changing. We won't be able to tell if it's the placement or if it's the message you wrote. And so we always want to be careful that really only one thing is changing. And we're going to see that in the example that we do live here. Okay. So quickly, just in the chat, what is the problem that we have with the test design below? So we have cell A, that's a $15 price point for a product. In cell B, we have a $25 price point for the product. We can assume that cell A is the control and cells B and C are the testing, the test experiences, right? So if I wanted to test these three cells, what is the problem with this test design? Right, Ira, there are two different factors being varied in here. We've got a UI change, which means like a aesthetic change on the website or how it's utilized, and a different price point, right? So we wouldn't be able to tell if it was the price point or the UI change that caused the difference in result. And sometimes our stakeholders will say, well, that's okay if they're all aggregated. But then you'll find that after you run the test, they're going to say, we changed our mind. Is there any way for you to tell us, how much of the difference was due to one piece and how much was due to the other piece? And we have to come back and say, no, that would be really difficult, if not impossible, to parse out because we lost valuable information in the way that this test was designed. And so we only have the aggregate effect of the combination of those two things together. Okay, so then we need to make sure that when we are working with our stakeholders to scope a hypothesis test, that we are testing a valid hypothesis, right? And so a hypothesis is a statement. Typically, we are testing the hypothesis that there is no effect, right? So even though we're making a change somewhere and we want to see if there is an effect, the null hypothesis is that there is no effect, and we hope that we get statistically significant results so that we can reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis that there is a difference. Okay, and so this hypothesis has to be measurable, right? Like you were hearing me say the words no difference versus there is a measurable difference, right? That's measurable, because sometimes people will throw hypotheses that they think are hypotheses over at the analytics team, and they'll say, we want to make this change and we want to see if there's an effect. But you have to know exactly what the success criteria is that you are testing. Are you expecting to see an increase in the number of conversions? Are you expecting to see an increase in the average sale price? Are you expecting to just see more people click on a certain thing? And you want to make sure that it's very clear what it is you're testing. So Laura, typically, so it's not, yeah, so you're trying to look and see if there is a statistically significant effect. And so the opposite of that is going to be that there is no statistically significant effect. So an example of a hypothesis is, if we implement cross-out pricing on a certain product that we're selling on our website, we will see an increase in conversion because people like that. So cross-out pricing is when you see the item for $25 and then there's a big slash mark through it, and instead it says $20. And so people know that they're getting a sale that way. And does that messaging drive conversion, right? And so we very clearly said that we're looking for an increase in conversion here. We're not, looking for an increase in total sales, or, we're very clear on what exactly the criteria is that we think is going to make a change. And so often a lot of this is really an exercise in communication and working cross-functionally with others to really nail down that the test is very clear and we know what the results are that we're looking to analyze. Right. So I already said this. Very often we'll see people saying, like, we're going to make this change and then we'd like you to read out on the results, right? And that is not clear enough. That is not a good use of your time. The hypothesis needs to clearly state what change is being made, the impact you expect it to have, and why you think it'll have that impact. It's not an open-ended statement. You are testing a measurable response to a change. The null hypothesis is that there's no change, and that's denoted with an H and a subscript 0. And the alternative hypothesis, and we're hoping that we get a statistically significant result, and then we reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis that there is an effect. And so it could either be a one-tail test that, there is no effect, or the effect is greater than, or it can be a two-tailed test where you say there's no effect, or the effect could either be positive or negative, and we don't really know. We're going to make a change and we don't know which way it's going to go. And actually that two-tailed, that second one that I just talked about, is frequently the most common that we use. Okay. And so when we're testing in industry, in a large organization, so a lot of times when people teach hypothesis testing, they don't talk about all these other things that we need to consider when you're in a large organization, because if the organization has a data science team, a data scientist in product and pricing and channel analytics and customer analytics and all these different teams, and they're all running tests, often they're not talking to each other enough. And so I actually spent a lot of time at one of my jobs, like organizing a process for us all to get together each month and mitigate these issues. Because if you launch a test and somebody else launches a test at the same time and they conflict, well, then everyone gets junk data back and no one can read out on their test. So an example of that might be if you're working for a business card company and in Google Ads, the acquisition channel team is trying to, see their ad performance or see how the landing page is working after they drive from Google to that landing page, right? So they're doing tests there in their Google Ads with different words, different messaging to see what people will click on. But if the pricing team was running a test at the same time and their test wasn't respecting the pricing that was being mentioned in the Google Ads, because the pricing team is running their own test, seeing, what about 500 business cards for $20 and, trying some different variants, you could end up getting sent from Google Ads to a landing page that shows a $20 price point instead of the price point that was mentioned in the Google ad. And now you've had a bad customer experience. They're probably not too happy. They're going to have a bad impression of the brand. And then nobody has any data to analyze their tests because it didn't actually give the experience that you were trying to test. And so we talked about those as well. So another thing that we need to consider is often, you'll define who your population criteria is, and often a group of people will be picked that maybe they've purchased in the last 3 months, because we want to make sure that people who are active are included in the test, right? And then at the end, the problem is that we can't extrapolate those results to the whole population of all of our customers, because these were the more active customers. And often we'll see a problem where marketing will just go around and tout, hey, we found that, we ran this test and we had X result. People were more likely to engage with this. And it's like, whoa, that result is only true for our people who have engaged in the last 3 months. And we want to make sure that we're putting those caveats and listing out these things when we present our analysis. Test duration always needs to be specified before you launch the test. And so this goes back to our sample size calculations that we talked about last week, right? You want to look at something similar to come up with an idea of how long it's going to take you to get enough sample size to analyze the results. And so if you decide that it should take about 3 weeks, at 3 weeks time, you need to shut off the test. And often stakeholders will come back and say, well, it's not statistically significant yet. How about we run it longer? And we can't do that, because if we run anything long enough, tiny results can become significant. And so we want to avoid this, people advocating for the test to run longer and ending up with a statistically significant result when in fact it's not true. On the flip side, also, sometimes when we're launching a new product on a page that doesn't get a lot of traffic yet, people can say, well, we want to test here. And when you look at the traffic ahead of time, that allows you to go back and say, hey, by the way, the effect size that you're looking for, it would take us 6 months to get the sample size to determine that. Let's talk about how we can do this differently, or place this test on a different page that gets more traffic so that we can get these results faster, because I'm sure you don't want to wait 6 months for this result. And of course, that's industry specific. There may be areas where people do wait 6 months for a result, but often in web testing, in e-commerce, it's that you wouldn't want to wait 6 months for a result. So Laura, to determine appropriate duration, and so we're going to look at code to help us determine the power of our test and sample size required. But you can look at, you'll have historical data about how many people were visiting a page, or if it's not, in websites, it's like, how many people are walking into the office regularly, or how many customers do you have that you can send an email to or a direct mailing to and see if they open it, right? And so you should have an understanding of, if they say the population criteria is this, you then query your data to find out how many customers actually fit that criteria. And so you're using data that may not, you can look at how many people have previously visited that web page over time and get an idea of, if you split that 50-50, how long it's going to take you to get the number of people you need. Yes, so Laura, it's also dependent on the industry and where you're applying the test. You're welcome. And so, yes, so the other thing that we want to be careful about is that, so often our stakeholders might ask us for, we're like, in this example, if we're running a test to see, we just put a new feature on the website, and are people going to click on it? And sometimes they'll be like, we want to see if it affected retention, if people canceled, if people called up to complain. And it's like, people probably aren't going to call up and complain about something that they're not forced to click on, right? They're probably not going to cancel their subscription if it's really early in the flow. And these things you start to learn as you are just around testing, right? You'll learn what the norms are for testing in your area. But one of the traps that you don't want to get stuck in is that somebody asks you for an analysis that takes 3 weeks when some of those metrics aren't relevant, right? And so what's the real big problem here? I have literally seen presentations where something completely benign is said to cause cancellations, okay? And so what really happened there? What really happened is that we've got 95% confidence. That means 1 out of 20 times, we're gonna erroneously say that something had an effect that had no effect. And that was what happened here, was we just kept testing, a bunch of different things, and then they go to show the results and they're like, wow, really interesting result. This drove cancellations. No, it didn't. So like, you have to use your understanding of the business and what is reasonable too. I mean, and so that erroneous result did warrant digging into. We had to see sort of why there was a dip in conversion, and it was that there was some bug somewhere. But the fact is, it had nothing to do with this test, right? And so you need to be really discerning about all sorts of different things. Okay. And so decisions, that's the other thing too, is a test has to result in a decision, and you need to really push the business to say, okay, well, if we do this test and it wins, what's going to happen? And if we do this test and there's no statistically significant effect, what's going to happen? Because if you're going to roll it out anyways, then my time could be better used doing an analysis that's actually going to affect business decisions, right? And this is important for your career, because if you end up analyzing a ton of stuff that is not significant and they roll it out anyways, which is fine. People are allowed to make strategic decisions for the business. But you want to know upfront, is this a strategic decision and we're going to roll it out anyways? Or is this a real test that we're running to understand, where we're going to, whether or not we're going to roll this thing out? Because you don't want to get in a place in your career where you've spent the last 6 months analyzing tests that didn't really have an impact on the business and got rolled out anyways, because they'll look at you and be like, what value have you really been adding? You spent a ton of time doing analysis and it didn't change what we chose to do as a business, right? So it's something to think about. Okay, so we talk a lot, like I'm sure you've heard previously, about alpha, which is that 0.05 most often cutoff. It is our true negative. And well, so the true negative is the 95%. False positive should only happen with that 0.05, which is our alpha. What we don't talk about quite as often is the power of our test, right? So instead of a false positive, we also need to be concerned about false negatives. And that has to do with the with beta and the power of our test. Okay, so statistical power is 1 minus beta. So we want to be able to talk about true negatives and true positives, like this 95% confidence that we always talk about. That's only this, true negatives and false positives, but we also need to worry about false negatives and true positives, right? And so the power is going to be affected by the significance level. So if alpha isn't 0.05, if it's 0.01, right, the power is going to change. As the sample size gets larger, the power will also get larger. If there is a lot of variability in the response variable, if it's that we're looking at purchases and the purchase prices are all over the map. Some people are spending 5 cents, some people are spending $300, right? And there's a large spread. As the variability increases, it's going to be more difficult to get a higher power, right? Which means that the rate of this false negative is going to go up. And yes, and as the difference between the means, so if we're testing two different things and the true difference is large, the power will be large. And that's what we want, but of course it's always a delicate balance. But you do want to make sure that, great, you have low false positives, right? But you want to make sure that you don't have super high false negatives. So, right, where we have control over the sample size, in theory, because we can let something run longer. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have a small sample and it's what we have to work with, and so we have to accept that we're going to have a lower power. We do have some control over the alpha, but there's also industry standards where if we're doing something in healthcare, like we need an alpha that's a lot tighter. We want 99% confidence, not 95% confidence. Sometimes we can go down to 90% confidence depending on the industry, but then we're talking about 1 in 10 times we're going to be making an erroneous conclusion. So, there is some wiggle room in some instances, but in some instances you have what you have, and it's more about correctly relaying what the real information is here. By the way, you know, we've got 95% confidence, but our false negative rate is, you know, higher than we'd like. And at least people know the real results and have a full understanding of the picture before they make a business decision. Okay, yeah. So, so if we are testing whether or not a change on the website leads to higher conversion, right? So this type 1 error would be saying that there was a change when there is not, and false negative is saying that there is no change when in fact there is. So Laura, conversion means that somebody visited a website and actually bought the product. But then there's also micro conversion. So a conversion often is industry specific, but it's often getting somebody to take an action that you wanted them to take. Okay, and so we talked about confidence intervals last week. We obviously want to be giving confidence intervals with our testing results, because if you come out and you say, wow, this is worth $700,000 a year, when in reality it's only worth $100,000 to $1.3 million, that could have a big impact on whether or not the business is going to put in the developer resources to build that product or make that, you know, actually roll it out, because there are costs typically associated with making strategic decisions, right? You have to put man hours behind it and bring it to fruition, because a lot of times these tests are, you know, on like a beta sort of, like an MVP, like on a product that doesn't actually really exist yet. And if there's enough demand, then they'll build out the systems and the functionality to make it a real part of the business. But so, you know, and this is hyperbole, but the fact is that confidence intervals are so important, because it's another aspect that gives your stakeholders the full picture of the decision that they're making, right? And then of course, so we're going to be going into R and looking at a test. But what I want to say before we do this is that consistency matters. So if you take a job at an organization and they are using a different statistical test to determine statistical significance, you're going to want to use the same test statistic that they are using, because the worst thing you can do is have two analysts analyze the same thing and get two different results, right? You want to make sure that everyone in the organization, that you're doing things the same way that other data scientists would be doing this, so that you're able to like actually look at the wins and losses, because there are differences between different statistical tests. Okay, and so there is a link in here. There is a link in here to a blog article that I wrote that has this wonderful cheat sheet that helps you determine what statistical test you use depending on the structure of your data and the structure of the response. So, so in the purple, you're talking about the hypothesis variable. In the red, you're looking at like, okay, what is the data type of the predictor variable? And so here, right, so this is like, we have, you know, if you have ordinal or nominal data, and you have two categories, and it's ratio data, and it's normally distributed, you can use and it's a univariate analysis, you can use the student's t-test, right? And so this blog article explains in much more detail sort of what each of the layers means and how to arrive at the appropriate test for your specific analysis. Okay, so this is the example that we're going to go through today in R. So you can see that the UI is exactly the same. And all we're doing here, and you notice that these prices are the same. And the difference is limited time was $60. So we're, you know, a lot of the testing that we do is pretty psychology related sometimes. And so, you know, the idea is a customer more motivated to buy if, you know, they think that they only have a limited time to buy it at $45. Okay. And so we're going to go over to R now. Okay. And so this power library you haven't used before in this course. So you'll need to install that. And then we need to call in the power library and dplyr, which we're all familiar with dplyr. This power library is going to allow us to calculate sample size and power calculations for our tests. So this is code that you'll definitely want to save for your job because it'll make your life easier. So I'm going to set my working directory, and this is a hypothesis test example. This is fictional data based on this example right here, right? And so we can look at what we have in our data. All right, so we only have 6 variables. We have about 44,000 observations, emoji fonts. And so we have your test assignment, which is, you know, what you're typically going to have, right? You're going to have people that are, it might even say test and control here. 1 means these people were randomly assigned to test. 0 means that the people were randomly assigned to control. And again, it's that randomization that allows us to get at whether or not there is a causal effect. And then the next variable is CONV, that stands for conversion. So these people were assigned to test or control, and then of that, how many of them converted? So this guy was in the control and he converted. This is the quantity. So how many resume courses did you buy? This person bought 1, and most people are only going to buy 1 because it is a virtual course, so it doesn't really make sense to buy 2. You know, the sale is $45 because that was the sale price, regardless of what test or control you were in, the price was the same. And then the cost to create, if this had been like a physical product, it doesn't really make sense in terms of a digital product. Of course, there are costs associated with hosting a digital product, but in like the physical product world, it's really important that we take into consideration the cost of creating those goods, right? And so we want to make sure that our test assignment, whether you're in test or control, is a factor variable so that we're able to look at it without our thinking that it's a regular number. And so here I have created a table to look at metrics that we would often look at when analyzing a test. So I don't want to spend too much time here because it sort of derails a bit what's going on. But so basically, I am taking this web test data and I am going to group by test assignment. And then I'm going to create a summary table that just says, what's the total number of visitors that came to the site? How many of these were distinct? So it's possible that some people cleared their browser cookies and came back to the site and then purchased. So they could have ended up in both test and control, and that would muddy our results. Somebody may have visited and then left and then came back and visited, but we want to make sure we count that as one single person, right? We don't want to count them twice. So I'm just getting a sense for how many distinct visitors do we have, because we're going to have an ID for each visitor. I'm going to count the number of conversions so I can start to see if the conversions are higher in test than they are in control just by eyeballing it. I'm also going to want to see that test and control have a balanced number of visitors, because if they're not balanced, right, we're supposed to be randomizing at 50-50 here. And if it's like wildly off with enough sample size, then that would signal to us that there was a problem implementing the test and that it might not have run correctly and that our results might not actually be representing what we think they are, and we'd need to dig into that a little bit more, right? And so then, of course, I'm going to want to look at the number of conversions over the number of visitors. I'm going to want to look at things like the average sales price, and these are all grouped by whether you're in test or control. So we're looking at the average sales price in test versus control, and we're looking at the average revenue, which is going to be the sales amount minus how much it cost us to create these goods. And so that's per visitor, revenue per visitor. We also want to look at sales per conversion and the average quantity, because we have that data. And then we can get an account too of how many duplicates we have in test and control. So the visitors that are not distinct minus the distinct number of visitors will give us an idea of how many people left the site and came back, and we're double counting them. Okay, and so Laura asked, does it matter if the data is normal or not normally distributed? So here, by the central limit theorem, we are able, the mean itself, we expect to be normally distributed. So the conversion percent, right, has like a mean of 19.5%. And if we were to repeat this, we'd expect it to be around 19.5%, but that's normally distributed. Even though this is a proportion, the proportion itself, whether somebody comes and converts, so they're a 0 or a 1, that's not normally distributed. But the mean itself is normally distributed. Okay, and so we have our control and we have our test. And so we see that the visitors are roughly balanced, and that's, something that we want to look at. And so that looks healthy. We see that we do have some duplicates. We see that we have our number of conversions, but we don't want to, we know that these numbers don't perfectly match up. So we don't want to make any, thoughts here. We want to look over here to this percent that convert and say, okay, yeah, wow, 23% does look higher than 19%. And then these are other relevant variables that the business might be interested in. So now you have code to do these things for them when you start analyzing tests. And so we also see that there are some duplicates. And so we're going to go back and we're going to remove those duplicates, because again, if we're counting somebody twice, we are not getting the real results. We need to remove those people that are in there twice so that we're counting one person, one visitor, rather than, if I visit 62 times, which you will find weird things like that. Somebody will visit 62 times and then finally convert, and you don't want that 62 in the denominator. That was one person. Okay, so all I did here was I just reran the same exact code, but with the duplicates removed. And so now we can see that the number of visitors we have matches the number of distinct customers, because we had gotten rid of the duplicates in the table, right? We see that the percent conversion didn't change too much, and we have other metrics that we can look at, and we also see that our duplicates are gone, right? So now we feel comfortable that we've looked at our data, and we can talk about we can move forward and do a statistical test now. And so if we look here, I'm just taking these number of visitors and number of number of conversions, and I'm putting them into a chi-squared test of proportions. Now, there are other tests that you could use here. And the public service announcement was that, and so I really like the chi-squared test. I would use it in this instance. You're going to see in the blog article that it is basically the same as using a t-test, the student's t-test. We are not using the continuity correction here. And so what that's going to do is make it a little bit more conservative, because we're telling it that we're not following the normal distribution that's continuous. But we could also say that it's true, because our proportion itself, the distribution of the mean, is actually can be approximated by a normal distribution. So to use this prop test, which is just a chi-squared test of proportion, this is one test. Again, you can use different tests. Again, we have the cheat sheet, and you're told how to use that, so you can print it out and keep it with you when you have to analyze statistical hypothesis tests in industry. How do you know which duplicate records you are removing? What if you remove the one where they convert? So that's a great point, Josh. Here, I removed everyone. real quickly, because I'm also worried about people who see both the test and control. So I just removed like all duplicates. So, yes, I would have removed the one where they convert. And when I do that, actually, we find that those people that you remove, I call them hoppers, they're typically the highest revenue generating people. And they're the most highest revenue generating people because they're also the people who would like come back to the site multiple times to allow them to be in multiple experiences. Let's see what I did here. Conversions 4296 5156. Right. So I did remove conversions here. I just removed all the duplicates. And so, yes, so you might want to write a more fancy script. So the point here was that I wanted to call out that like duplicates are a problem. We need to get rid of them. Yes, depending on how your organization handles them, you may, completely remove them. You may also say, okay, if they come in on test first, I'm going to allocate them to test. And if your organization decides how to like that's how they're going to do it, then you're going to follow suit with that too. So there's like a lot of wiggle room here. And I assume that people aren't going to be analyzing hypothesis tests on their own outside of a company. I don't know if someone's going to be a consultant and work for themselves, then you'd certainly want to give thought to this. But in general, you're going to get into a company and they're going to have processes and ways of handling these things. And you're going to need to be consistent with how they do it anyways. Yeah, so here we kept the first instance. Yeah, but Josh, I wouldn't want to do that either. Yeah, so I might not necessarily want to get rid of the where conversion equals 0 because mathematically that might not be true either. What Danielle just suggested of keeping the last is a really good suggestion. We'd expect that the last time they visited during the test period would be the time that they convert, but that's not necessarily true either. People can convert and then come back to the site to just check on their order, and you end up keeping a 0. And so there's not a perfect way to do it without giving it a whole lot of thought. Okay, so, right, so we had recreated this table, but so this is how easy it is to literally run a test and understand whether or not there was a statistically significant difference. Okay, so here we see that the p-value is obviously less than 0.05. It's very, very, very small. We can double check that we entered the correct information into the numerator and denominator because these proportions match the proportions in our table. And so all we did here was a test for equality of proportions. We used a continuity correction, which you don't need to worry about too much because even if I changed this to false, it's not going to be wildly different because there was 40,000 observations. So the chi-squared statistic that was used to determine the p-value, which is similar to, so a chi-squared is actually a normal distribution squared. And 106.87 versus 107.12, the conclusion is still very much the same. The p-value is quite small. And again, so without continuity correction, means that you are assuming that it is a discrete population. Here, we are assuming continuous data. And like I said, the idea of someone coming to the site and them converting or not is discrete, but the idea that the mean is about 23.6, and if we were to run this again, we might get 23.9 or 24, that's continuous. Okay. And so we can see what the average difference is. The average difference was about 4% between these two proportions. And because we have all the information, we can calculate the confidence intervals. So we knew what the sample size was of each of these. We know that the proportion is the number of conversions in test over the denominator in test, and similarly, the conversions, this one's test, the conversions in test over the sample size in test, and the number of conversions in control over the sample size in the control group, right? And so these should be the proportions that we've been looking at. We can create a 95% confidence interval using Z of alpha over 2 equal to 1.96. And then here I am manually calculating the standard error or standard deviation. And so using the estimate plus the Z of alpha times the standard error gives us the upper bound, and the estimate minus the Z statistic times the standard error gives us the lower bound. And so we can look at these. And we can do the same thing for the other estimate. Okay, and we look at these intervals and we can see that they don't touch at all, not even close, right? So we're able to understand and see why it was super statistically significant that that there was a difference between these two means. And we're also able to see that here, right? Because we calculated the average difference, which was about 4%. And we see that, you know, there's this interval right here is nowhere near 0. And so using the formula for differences too, we could replicate this confidence interval that's right here. And then here's information about the t-test that, again, it's just t.test, and you give it your X and your Y as actual vectors, and you're able to get a result for that, and it's going to look very close to our chi-squared test. Okay. And so now we're going to talk about the sample size calculator. And so we're using the Power library for that. And there's this function power.ttest that allows us to fill in. So D is the effect size. So here we're saying we want to be able to detect a difference of 0.02 in the means. We want the significance level, the alpha, to be 0.05. We want the power of our test to be at least 0.75. And this is a paired test because we have, test and control pairs. And so here, because n is null, it's going to spit out a sample size for us. Right? And so it automatically fills in, we need 17,000 pairs, right? So we need 17,000 in control and 17,000 in test. And that's because we left sample size null. But the beauty of this single function is that it can also be a power calculator. So we can say, okay, we have 40,000 pairs. We have the same effect size. We're still using a significance level of 0.05. And so let's say, we know we're going to have, we've looked at how many hits we get to the website. We're going to let the test run for 3 weeks. We expect to get 40,000 pairs. And your stakeholder says, well, what's the power of the test? And so if you guys could answer in the chat real quick, when you look at this, is the power going to be higher or lower than 0.75? Is the power going to be, when I run this, is the power going to be higher or lower than 0.75? And Francisco already ran it. Yeah, it is. It's going to be higher, right? Because the only thing that changed here is instead of having 17,000 pairs, we moved it up to 40,000 pairs. And so as the sample size goes up, the power is going to increase. So if your stakeholders ask you, what sample size is required for this? Now you have a formula. What is the power on that test? Use the same formula, right? And then depending on what it is you are testing and the structure of your data, you can use that blog article provided to figure out what statistical test you should be using. And so here we used a chi-squared test. And if you use the blog article, you'll see that it suggests the student's t-test, and that is a perfectly valid test, and that for this example. And so that's some of the difficulty and ambiguity in statistics, is that if you talk to a number of different people, they are going to have their way of doing things that is not necessarily right or wrong. Often it's like a series of trade-offs that they've made. But, at the end of the day, really, your organization is going to have a test statistic that they use for certain scenarios. They'll have a different test statistic that they use for other data structures that require a different type of test, and you will want to follow the process that they use so that you come up with a similar, so that, whether you or your colleague performs the test, you get a similar result. or the same result. Okay, so this is a document that I had created that I ended up using in industry just to nail down all the details, because so often, since people are rushed, they'll come over and they say, we want to test this, we want to launch it in a couple of weeks, and you know, this is the change we're going to make, and we want to test this. And then sometimes you sit there and think about it, you go to set up the test and you realize that you don't have all the information that you needed to set this up correctly. So typically when a stakeholder comes to me and they say they want to run a test, I say, great, put 15 minutes on my calendar. We're going to get together and we're going to scope this out and make sure that it's all nailed down, right? This is like a cover your butt sort of procedure, because you need to get all the information so that when you launch your test, it can run as expected and you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's, so that you don't come back and you say, oh, I can't analyze this for you. Something was broken, or we didn't consider, you know, how long it had to run for, whatever. So this just, it's, you know, it has a spot for, you know, the metrics that are going to be included in the analysis. So if you deterred from the, you know, usual plan for this specific test, you have it documented what exactly you were going to deliver to your stakeholders, so that if they come back and they say, well, I thought you were going to do this for me, you can look and you can say, hey, we sat down and we did this together and we talked about these metrics, and maybe I'm happy to go get that for you. Maybe we scoped it in a way that that's not possible for me to go get that for you, right? Or maybe we chose to do it this way because it's not relevant for me to look at that. And again, it sort of forces people to talk about the decision that's going to be made, so you can understand ahead of time if you're potentially going to be wasting your time working on tests that aren't going to result in a decision for the business. Okay, so here we analyzed a site test. We talked about a number of considerations that you'll want to think about when testing in industry, and we learned about proper test design and analysis. Okay, and so that is what I have for today. And so now I can take a look at, it looks like the chat has been super active. Okay, so the link to the blog article was in the slides, but I can grab that for you. Yes, that's the article. I've got it right here. I'm gonna share it in 2 seconds. Oh, yeah, and Danielle already pasted it on the discussion board. And there it is right there as well. Yeah, Paul, yeah, totally agree with Danielle. You can absolutely run it both ways and compare the results. You want to make sure that you don't get into the habit, though, of like choosing which one looks better, right? Like you need to, like the organization has to decide, we're going to use first or we're going to use last, just so that things are consistent, so that, you know, we don't look and say, ooh, well, if I picked this one, then it's statistically significant, so I'm going to use that one, right? Which happens in business. Okay, are there any other questions? All right, so if there are no questions, we can end lecture there, and just make sure that if you come up with questions or if anything is confusing, make sure you reach out. I hear that there was a problem with the support tab. Danielle, do we know if that problem is fixed?
I have not heard back about any details yet. The message was passed on, and I'll check in with them again today and see what the status of that is.
Okay, so then make sure to use the discussion board. Right, so the discussion board will be your place to sort of stay in the loop. Right, Laura, the support tab is currently not working. So we are directing people to the discussion board to post their queries. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And then I believe the week after that is a break, right? Or is it 2 weeks?
I'm not sure about the break. I have to double
Yeah.
check on that, but I do
I'm
want
not
to note
sure either,
that
but we do have class next week, so we will see you next week.
I want to note that there was a message sent out yesterday, I believe, saying that office hours next week will not be happening. That is not the case. So I'm trying to get the actual message sent out. Next week, office hours are as regular time. I believe that's 1 p.m. UTC, but that is posted under the office hours tab. So the time is there, and next week we'll proceed as normal.
All right. Awesome. Everyone have a fantastic week.